There is a moment in every room you walk into when people decide how much of you they are allowed to take. It happens in seconds, before you speak, before you explain yourself, before you even sit down, and most people never notice it happening because the moment feels invisible, feels like nothing, feels like simple politeness. But it is not nothing. It is the entire architecture of how you will be treated for the rest of that encounter, and often for the rest of that relationship. You have felt this before. The meeting where your idea was ignored until someone else repeated it and suddenly it mattered. The friendship where your time was always available, always flexible, always the first to bend. The room where you spoke and no one quite turned their head. Something in you sensed it. Something in you knew you had already lost before you had even begun. What if I told you this was not bad luck? What it was not because you were not smart enough or kind enough or accomplished enough? What if it was something else entirely? Something learned, something structural, something that can be unlearned. Most people spend their entire lives chasing likability, believing that if they are agreeable enough, warm enough, accommodating enough, respect will simply follow like a reward for good behavior. This is the great misunderstanding of the modern age, and it is not entirely their fault. They have been taught since childhood that being liked is the highest currency a person can hold. So they smile more than necessary. They apologize before they have done anything wrong. They soften every request into a question, every opinion into a maybe, every boundary into a suggestion that can be negotiated away. And the world, sensing this softness, obliges, not with cruelty usually, but with a quiet, almost unconscious diminishment. People do not consciously decide to disrespect the accommodating. They simply stop factoring them into the calculus of consequence. If nothing happens when you take from this person, why would you ever stop taking? Watch closely, and you will see this pattern everywhere, playing out in people who would never think of themselves as weak. The coworker who takes on every extra task because refusing feels unbearable and is rewarded not with gratitude but with more tasks and less credit, because generosity without limits reads not as strength but as a lack of a floor. The friend who is always the one to reach out, to apologize first, to smooth things over, and who slowly becomes the friend whose feelings are simply assumed to be fine because they have never once demonstrated that they might not be. The partner who gives everything early, who reveals every insecurity, every need, every fear in the name of honesty and closeness, and who wakes up one day wondering why the other person seems to have stopped trying. None of these people did anything monstrous. None of them were naive in any way that should have been punished. They simply never understood a law that governs every human interaction, whether they acknowledge it or not. People treat you exactly as well as your behavior teaches them they are allowed to. The few who understand this operate completely differently, and it is not because they are colder or crueler or more calculating in some sinister sense. It is because they understand something that took them, usually, a great deal of pain to learn, that respect is never given freely as a gift. It is extracted through evidence. Evidence that you have limits. Evidence that you notice when you are being used. Evidence that your attention, your time, your warmth are not bottomless resources to be mined without cost. This is uncomfortable to hear because it suggests that the people you admire most, the people who seem to move through the world with an effortless gravity, a quiet authority that makes rooms rearrange themselves slightly around their presence, that this was not an accident of birth or personality, but the result, consciously or not, of 1,000 small refusals to be diminished. History offers this lesson again and again, if you know where to look. In the courts of old Europe, where survival depended entirely on the perception others held of you, the most successful courtiers were rarely the most agreeable. They were the ones who mastered the art of controlled scarcity, who gave their favor selectively, who let their absence be felt as strongly as their presence, who understood that a compliment given too easily loses all its value, while one given rarely becomes a currency people will scheme to earn. The generals who held their armies together through impossible campaigns were not the ones who begged for loyalty. They were the ones who demonstrated through unwavering consistency that certain lines would never be crossed, that certain behaviors would never be tolerated, and that this consistency itself was a kind of magnetism. Even in the world of seduction, the ancient art of it, The great seducers throughout history understood a brutal truth that still holds today: nothing kills desire faster than total, immediate availability. The moment you become fully possessible, fully predictable, fully safe, something in the human animal, some old, unspoken evolutionary wiring, begins to lose interest. This is not because human beings are shallow. It is because human beings are, at the level of instinct, built to value what is scarce and to devalue what is abundant. This is not a flaw in human nature. It is the operating system of human nature. For hundreds of thousands of years, resources were finite, safety was uncertain, and the beings who commanded status, who commanded protection, who commanded loyalty, were the ones who demonstrated strength, not through aggression alone, but through composure, through unpredictability, through the simple, quiet fact that they could not be taken for granted. We like to believe we have evolved past these ancient instincts, that we are creatures of reason now, governed by fairness and empathy alone. But watch how a room reacts to someone who commands it without raising their voice, and you will see the old wiring still humming beneath the surface, unchanged, unmoved by centuries of civilization. This is why the person who gives too much, too fast, too easily, is so often met not with gratitude, but with a strange, almost involuntary contempt. It is not that people are ungrateful by nature. It is that the nervous system reads unearned abundance as a signal of low value, the same way it reads a product with no price tag freely available to anyone as somehow less desirable than one that is guarded, limited, hard to obtain. You have felt the truth of this yourself. On the other side of it, the friend whose validation meant nothing because it came for everyone, unconditionally, regardless of what you did. The mentor whose praise felt hollow because it came too easily, too often, for too little. And on some level, if you are honest, you have likely done this to others too. Dismissed quietly the people who made themselves too available, too eager, too easy to have. The deepest truth here, the one that changes everything once you absorb it, is this: respect is not the reward for being good. It is the reward for being unmistakable. It is the reward for demonstrating through consistent, quiet action that you have a self that exists independently of other people's approval of it. A self with its own standards, its own limits, its own sense of worth that does not fluctuate based on whether the room happens to be paying attention to you in this particular moment. People do not respect those who need them. They respect those who could, if necessary, walk away entirely intact. Weak people believe respect is earned through explanation. They will tell you at length why they deserve better treatment, cataloging their sacrifices, their qualifications, their good intentions, as if respect were a debate to be won through sufficient evidence presented aloud. Powerful people understand that respect is never argued into existence. It is demonstrated silently through behavior that requires no defense because it needs none. The moment you find yourself explaining why you deserve to be treated well, you have already lost the frame, because you have revealed that your sense of worth requires the other person's agreement to be real. Weak people apologize for taking up space, for having preferences, for having needs, for having a schedule that does not bend infinitely to accommodate everyone else's convenience. Powerful people understand that an apology is a precise instrument reserved for genuine transgressions, and that scattering it across every interaction, every request, every disagreement, dilutes it into meaninglessness and teaches everyone around them that their existence itself requires justification. The self-possessed do not apologize for existing. They simply exist, fully, without asking permission. Weak people reveal everything immediately, believing that total transparency is the fastest path to intimacy and trust. Powerful people understand a harder, more uncomfortable truth: that mystery is not dishonesty, and that revealing yourself slowly, deliberately, in proportion to what has actually been earned by the other person, is not manipulation but self-respect. There is nothing dishonest about privacy. There is nothing cold about pacing. What feels to the anxious mind like withholding is often simply the natural behavior of someone who understands their own value does not need to be proven on demand to anyone on the very first day. Here is the first internal rule worth adopting, and it will feel unnatural at first because everything worthwhile does. Before you agree to anything, before you soften a boundary, before you say yes out of some reflexive fear of disappointing someone, pause, even for 2 seconds, and ask yourself a single question: am I doing this because I want to or because I am afraid of what happens if I do not. That pause alone, that tiny gap between stimulus and response, is where your power lies. Most people never find it because they have trained themselves to close that gap instantly, out of habit, out of fear, out of a lifetime of believing that hesitation itself is a kind of rudeness. It is not. Hesitation is where the self reasserts itself. The second rule is this: stop narrating your limits before you enforce them. The person who says over and over, "I really need to start saying no to people," and never does, has taught everyone around them that their boundaries are theoretical, a kind of performance of self-respect rather than the thing itself. The person who simply quietly, without announcement, begins declining what does not serve them teaches the world something far more powerful through action alone. Boundaries that are constantly discussed and never enforced become background noise. Boundaries that are simply lived become law. The third rule, and perhaps the hardest, is to become comfortable with the discomfort of another person's disappointment. Somewhere along the way, you were taught, likely without anyone meaning to teach it, that someone else's disappointment in you is a kind of emergency to be immediately resolved. It is not. Disappointment is simply information, a signal that someone wanted something from you that you did not choose to give, and that is allowed to exist unresolved without you rushing in to fix it at the cost of yourself. The moment you can sit with another person's mild displeasure without collapsing into appeasement, you have crossed a threshold that most people never cross in their entire lives. None of this requires cruelty. None of this requires becoming cold or distant or manipulative in the way the word is often used to frighten people out of self-possession. What it requires is something much simpler and much harder: the willingness to let your actions, rather than your explanations, do the work of teaching people who you are. The generals did not beg for respect. The courtiers did not plead for favor. The ones who moved through history with quiet, undeniable gravity did so because they understood that presence is not loud. Presence is consistent. Presence is the simple, unshakable fact of a person who does not need the room's approval to remain fully themselves within it. Think back to that moment you first imagined. The room, the meeting, the silence that met your voice while someone else's identical idea was met with nods. That moment was not a verdict on your worth. It was a mirror showing you exactly how much space you had until that point taught the world you were willing to occupy. The good news, the only news that actually matters here, is that mirrors change the instant the person in front of them changes. You are not sentenced to a lifetime of being overlooked. You are simply, right now, at the exact moment where the pattern becomes visible, and a pattern that becomes visible is a pattern that has already begun to lose its grip on you. Command respect not by asking for it, not by demanding it, not by cataloging your qualifications for it, but by becoming quietly and consistently someone who does not need it to survive. Let your presence be the argument. Let your consistency be the proof. Let your boundaries live in your actions rather than your speeches. This is not cruelty. This is not coldness. This is simply the oldest law of human nature, older than any court, any war, any romance ever recorded, that the world will always, eventually, treat you exactly as well as you have taught it to. The next time you walk into that room, you will not be waiting to see how you are treated. You will already know, because you will not just react to it. You will see it before it happens, and in that seeing, you will already have changed the outcome entirely.